everyone, I'm Danny Roddy of DannyRoddy.com, and today I'm talking with Georgi, an independent health researcher and owner of IdeaLabsDC.com. Today, Georgi and I will discuss osteoporosis from a bioenergetic point of view, or the interaction between an organism and its environment and how those changes influence cellular respiration. In addition to thanking Georgi for talking with me today, I'd like to thank my patrons for making this show and all the content I produce possible. If you would like to become a patron, please go to patreon.com/DannyRoddy. As always, please do your own research and come to your own conclusions, and in the spirit of William Blake, the true method of knowledge is experiment. Without further ado, here's the show. So I don't know any other way to kind of go about talking about osteoporosis without talking about estrogen first. Is that the page you were on too?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, if you look at that's really like the main idea around which mainstream medicine revolves, combined with like the menopause and deficiency of a few other things, and they say testosterone in men is like the cause for one of the causes in men. Trials with testosterone were actually negative, and I guess we're going to talk more about that later. But basically, yeah, that's like the main. I think that's the main topic, and genetics, of course. They're saying up to 80% of these cases are hereditary.
So I wanted to read a quote from Constance R. Martin, and she wrote a book called Endocrine Physiology that came out in 1985, and I think it typifies the view. I think a good view towards estrogen. So she says, several explanations for the beneficial effects of estrogens have been offered, but there are problems with many of them. So I think that makes me think of how estrogen slows down osteoclasts or inhibits them, and how that can be used as a rationale for using estrogen for decreasing the progression of osteoporosis, and kind of viewing that function of estrogen in a vacuum and then not considering any of the other effects. So I wanted to get your thoughts on how estrogen became to be known as a bone protective substance, and how that idea, and we'll go through the episode and kind of unravel it and talk about what's actually supporting bone health and bone growth into old age.
Sure. So I think the role of estrogen in osteoporosis very closely mimics the idea of the rate of living theory, right? The faster you live, like the sooner you're going to die. I think that's a very popular idea in many medical circles, and they're trying to apply it to many specific problems, not just aging. And the idea is that if, since estrogen has been found, and by the way, only in low doses, to inhibit the activity of the osteoclasts, which are the cells that break bone down, basically, they're saying an overall estrogen slows down the rate of bone metabolism, and as such, basically we're all gonna age and die, so our only hope is slowing down the process. So if estrogen slows down the process of bone metabolism, that must be a good thing. Just like slowing the general rate of metabolism, is considered a good thing. And for that, I think we already know that that's not only not the case, but even mainstream medicine is now turning around and saying and using, uncoupling drugs that increase metabolism to treat a lot of neurodegenerative conditions like obesity, diabetes, even cancer, and so on. So I think that the combination of flawed reasoning combined with the really masterful marketing strategies by the drug industry have created this idea that since the theory is that estrogen declines after menopause, and the rate of osteoporosis increases dramatically after menopause, then estrogen must be the protective factor, because the mainstream view is that estrogen synthesis decreases because the ovaries fail and there's no more of this protective estrogen, right? Everybody admits that women, even in younger age, have a much higher rate of osteoporosis than men do, but nobody asked the question of why this is true even in younger age when estrogen is supposed to be produced at normal levels. The focus is shifted towards what happens after menopause. For men, the statement is that we don't know exactly what causes it in men. We know that it also increases with aging, but the estrogen is also thought to be a protective factor there because men also produce estrogen. And by the way, by the time they're in their mid-50s, they produce as much and even more estrogen than women do, especially if they're obese. So the theory is also that estrogen can be helpful for slowing down the rate of bone metabolism and bone destruction in men as well. However, what is known officially, official medicine admits about estrogen is that in low doses it may inhibit osteoclasts, but in high doses it directly kills them, and it also kills the osteoblasts. So yes, it does inhibit bone metabolism. It actually can stop it completely, and in very high doses, estrogen can directly trigger fractions, spontaneous fractures. And for obvious and ethical reasons, this has only been tried in animal models. But it is known that high dose of estrogen is definitely not bone protective for animals, at least. And of course, there's the genetic factor. The official statement is up to 80% of all of these of the osteoporosis predisposition is inherited, and as such, there isn't much that can be done about it other than supplement estrogen for women and then estrogen and or testosterone for men, sort of like to try to slow down this process.
It's not like this is a theory that estrogen is bad for bones and it hasn't been tested. This HRT has gone through the ringer of tests, and it has been employed to a great degree since 1972, when the FDA approved it for the prevention of osteoporosis. And a major landmark showing its true efficacy was the Women's Health Initiative, which pretty much showed that the incidence of hip fractures increased as the percentage of women using estrogen also increased. And I think the Women's Health Initiative showed many other dangers of estrogen during that time too, like heart attack, cancer, and dementia, etc., breast cancer.
Yeah, also dramatic tissue atrophy, especially of the skin and some vital organs like the spleen, the uterus, and things like that. And in other organs, basically, even though it caused atrophy of the breast, it did increase the proliferation of cells in certain areas of the breast. It was marketed as, well, don't worry about it, estrogen is actually making your breast grow. You can see how nefarious that is, because many women may actually find this a very, very attractive proposition. Not only estrogen is making them healthy, but it's also making them more beautiful. Nothing really can be further from the truth. And I think a very direct example of why this is flawed reasoning can be given by the fact that even according to mainstream medicine, estrogen is one of the primary triggers of cortisol and prolactin. And these two hormones, nobody out there, not even the most deluded doctor bathing in a genetic theory, has the goal to claim that these two hormones somehow promote bone health. It's the exact opposite, actually. Everybody admits that prolactin is very well known, especially to gynecologists, to dramatically decrease bone density because it increases bone resorption to provide calcium for the production of milk if calcium is insufficient in the diet. And even if it is sufficient in the diet, after pregnancy, and as long as lactation is present, prolactin is elevated, and it contributes to thinning of the bones. Cortisol doesn't really need any introduction as far as a bone destructive hormone. People that have the condition Cushing syndrome or Cushing disease, one of their first symptoms actually that alerts them to the fact that they have some kind of a problem is some kind of a spontaneous fracture or unexpected fracture that happened during normal daily activity without any specific strain or anything like that. So it is very well known that cortisol thins the bones and also weakens them. Even in the presence of normal bone density, you have a much higher chance of breaking a bone if your cortisol is high. Some populations where cortisol is very high chronically include the long distance endurance exercise type people, such as marathon runners, bicycle cyclists, people that do stuff that basically strenuous exercise. These people are known to have a very high rate of spontaneous fractures. As a matter of fact, if you watch any marathon occurring, you will see that by the finish line there's always an ambulance. I mean, I guess there's always an ambulance in any kind of like a mass event, but the people that are in the ambulance, they usually have two specialties. They're either people that specialize in cardiovascular events, because the people who run marathons, they have a much higher chance of getting a heart attack or stroke while running. And then the second person that's in the ambulance is usually a person who specializes in bone problems, like an orthopedician or a registered nurse that knows about fractures. Because that's the other thing that happens. These fractures usually happen either in the hip or basically lower down towards below the ankle or around the ankle. And this is a very these same fractures are what characterizes advanced osteoporosis. So you can see it happen very quickly in people that have elevated levels of prolactin and cortisol. And given that estrogen is one of the primary stimulators of these two hormones, I really don't see how the whole theory of giving estrogen can cure or prevent osteoporosis, how they can be defended. As a matter of fact, if you want to know your doctor, try to raise that point with him or her, and you'll see that you'll either get a blank stare or you may be asked to find a new doctor.
Before we talk about thyroid, and you brought up breathless exercise, so we should talk about lactic acid and carbon dioxide. Are there any other therapies or so-called therapies that you know of that are mainstream for osteoporosis?
People are given biphosphonates, but it's been shown to if it helps at all, it only helps people that have not had a fracture yet. And the whole diagnosis of osteoporosis is really nefarious unless you have a radiology diagram from an X-ray, and we're going to talk about why X-rays themselves are really bad. Unless you have a radiology diagram that shows that the bone is really thinned, there really isn't much in terms of formal diagnosis of osteoporosis except your doctor's opinion. Many people are given these biphosphonate drugs just as a precautionary measure, but then the fact that they don't develop a fracture are counted as a win for the drug. However, these drugs have very, very serious side effects, including kidney failure and calcification of the soft tissues, especially around the heart. Even short-term biphosphonate intake, because of the phosphates that are inside, is very dangerous for your cardiovascular system. So as such, they're not as mainstream therapy, fortunately, as the drug industry had once hoped them to be.
In Ray's article, Osteoporosis, Aging, Tissue Renewal, and Product Science, he talks about inherited condition in humans called osteopotrosis, or marble bone disease. And that's caused by a lack of carbonic anhydrase enzyme and them to retain very high levels of carbon dioxide. And they just have incredibly thick bones, hence the name marble bone disease. And on the flip side, you mentioned earlier that breathless exercise increases lactic acid and causes bones to basically disintegrate over time. Do you want to talk about how cellular respiration is guiding the whole process of bone remodeling and deterioration?
Yep, I think you bring in some very good points, and I'm going to actually bring sugar into the whole picture because it is one of the things that is cited as a risk factor. In other words, drinking sugary drinks or consuming sugar in general is officially stated to dramatically increase your risk of osteoporosis because it acidifies your body and because it leads, to leaching of the bone and basically loss of calcium in the urine, and as such, it thins your bones over time. So that condition, osteopotrosis, actually, it's not so much characterized by very thick bones as by extremely tough bones. These people's bones are almost impossible to break. And if the levels of carbon dioxide rise too much, which is what happens if carbonic anhydrase levels are really low, they start getting spinal fusion, and which may compress the spinal cord and the brainstem, and they may die from it. But basically, what is known is in the autopsies of these people is that their bones are extremely heavy and extremely tough. It's almost holding like a stick of steel. It is known, and it's openly admitted, that this is due to the abnormally high levels of carbon dioxide, which, by the way, is predominantly absorbed by the bone once you produce it in your body. And carbon dioxide, the production of carbon dioxide, it happens mostly through the oxidation of sugar. And basically, you have two routes when you eat sugar. If metabolism is working well, you're going to produce carbon dioxide. It will get absorbed by the bones, and basically, it will be used together with vitamin K to create a protein called osteocalcin, which binds calcium, and basically, it's used to shuttle it to the bone, where basically it binds with because the carbon dioxide binds calcium, it creates calcium carbonate. And also later on, you can also have calcium phosphate. But basically, osteocalcin, under the influence of vitamin K and carbon dioxide, is what is the primary factor of building new bone. Now, that's one route of sugar metabolism. The other route, if metabolism is not working well, is for the organism to produce lactic acid. And lactic acid of course, it's a well-known factor in acidifying the body and causing the loss of calcium and thinning of the bone. Unfortunately, mainstream view doesn't distinguish between the two kinds of acidosis. You can have respiratory acidosis, which is characterized by the high levels of carbon dioxide, which is actually very, very protective for the bone. And you can have the metabolic acidosis, which is the high lactic acid, which is extremely detrimental to the bone. However, avoiding sugar is not going to help you much, because what happens is that in the avoidance of sugar, cortisol and adrenaline will rise, which will increase lipolysis, and lipolysis basically due to the high adrenaline, lipolysis will increase the levels of free fatty acids in the blood. I think we've talked about this, ad nausea. Like if these are mostly PUFA, they'll on their own increase cortisol and estrogen. Adrenaline, by the way, itself is very catabolic for the bone. So if you don't provide sugar, the body will get the sugar from somewhere, which is basically your muscle tissue and your organs, and also the increased lipolysis and the high adrenaline. They directly contribute to bone resorption as well. So avoiding sugar is definitely not the solution. However, just because you're eating more sugar doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go into the beneficial pathway. In other words, proper oxidative phosphorylation is paramount to form enough carbon dioxide to support proper bone health.
We talk about lipolysis and the Randall cycle and the polyunsaturated fats really often. Did you want to touch on, less often, I think we probably talk about the prostaglandins, and to my surprise, that's news to a lot of people of like what prostaglandins are. And if you dig a little bit of the so-called alternative view, they think that some prostaglandins are good and some are bad. Whereas Ray Peat usually says, hey, they're mostly linked to these degenerative conditions. And one of those degenerative conditions is the prostaglandin PGE2, which not only it seems to be part of this vicious cycle of lactic acid, estrogen, etc. And the increase in prostaglandins can only happen when there's an increase in lipolysis, and the unsaturated fats, the so-called essential unsaturated fats, are substrate for the production of these prostaglandins.
Yeah, and these prostaglandins are one of the few major inflammatory mediators. And as such, first of all, the prostaglandins themselves directly increase both the production and the activity of the enzyme aromatase in your tissues. So anytime you have an increased levels of these so-called, even if the beneficial, quote unquote, because there aren't any, of the beneficial prostaglandins, you're going to produce more estrogen. Estrogen is going to trigger the production of cortisol. Prostaglandins themselves also directly trigger the production of cortisol. So you're going to increase the production of more hormones that are known to be actually very detrimental for bone health. In addition, the prostaglandins themselves are highly correlated with some other inflammatory biomarkers such as tumor necrosis factor alpha and NFKB. Both of these are highly detrimental for bone health, and it has been found that people that have the chronic elevation of these two biomarkers, especially people with rheumatoid arthritis, they're at a dramatically higher risk for early osteoporosis. And some of the new drugs on the market for rheumatoid arthritis that inhibit TNF-alpha and NFKB have been found to have the desirable and beneficial, for unknown reason, side effect of improving bone health. So you don't want to increase inflammation. It is not good unless it is in the short term and it's done for an adaptive purpose to heal a wound or battle an infection.
Did you want to talk about the connection between thyroid, copper, and cytochrome C oxidase and how that relates to bone health?
Well, I mean, basically the proper production of carbon dioxide is, if we assume that that's paramount for bone health, the proper production of carbon dioxide cannot happen without the presence and the proper activity of thyroid hormone. Now, what thyroid hormone does, it stimulates the cellular metabolism mostly through increasing the levels and the activity of cytochrome C oxidase. And cytochrome C oxidase is a copper-dependent protein. Now, you can take all the thyroid you want, but if there isn't sufficient copper, and if you're iron dominant, on the other hand, your metabolism will not work well, and you will not produce sufficient carbon dioxide. And you'll not synthesize enough ATP. So taking thyroid tends to stimulate the absorption of copper from the bloodstream into the cells and also from the diet. And I think that's one of the reasons why people get copper toxicity symptoms, because they load up on copper from supplements, but they don't realize that just like magnesium, the proper absorption and utilization of copper depends on thyroid hormone, mainly because thyroid hormone is the primary stimulator of the synthesis of the copper-carrying protein ceruloplasmin. And without it, copper is very, very dangerous. So basically, you see the connection between thyroid, copper, cytochrome C oxidase, and proper production of carbon dioxide. Without any of these factors, carbon dioxide production will not be optimal. The entire bone metabolism process, characterized by destruction and renewal, will not go properly.
In menopause, iron absorption is increased, and I've been intermittently pretty obsessed with learning about iron and copper. And I wrote Ray probably in 2011 or so, and I was like, hey, what's a good test to monitor your iron status? And he basically said that there wasn't any, and that hormones and your life processes were controlling the utilization and absorption of iron. In later episodes, Ray mentioned iron saturation as being a somewhat reliable test. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Because copper and iron are capable of partially substituting for each other, what happens is that if you have an overload of iron, you'll have a functional copper deficiency, which, by the way, can even cause copper toxicity, because if copper cannot be carried properly to the cell, you'll accumulate in the blood, and in order to protect you from the toxic effects of copper, because it is a heavy metal after all, the liver will absorb it, and you'll basically have copper toxicity inside the liver. You may get liver failure because of too much bio-unavailable copper. The thing is, because of during aging and the decrease of thyroid hormone, people tend to lose more copper and not absorb enough copper. And even if they do, without enough ceruloplasmin, this copper is not very usable. In the absence of copper, the body will increase both its absorption and utilization of iron. And what happens is both serum iron and some of the biomarkers of iron overload, such as ferritin, transferrin, and iron saturation, they will change in a way that is indicative of an iron overload. So, for example, there is a very well-known situation called anemia of chronic disease, and it's characterized by normal or low serum levels of iron, dramatically high ferritin. And ferritin is the protein that basically helps us use this iron, makes it available to the cell. So it is a really perverse statement, because it's really not an anemia of chronic disease. It's actually a condition of extreme iron overload. And it is seen in almost every chronic degenerative disease, especially cancer, and some other conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis. I think people with Alzheimer's tend to have a high ferritin, or so-called anemia of chronic disease. People with Crohn's disease and other inflammatory bowel diseases. Basically, if your ferritin is high, it is a state of iron overload, not really of iron deficiency. And mainstream medicine recognizes that, even though it calls it anemia, it basically says in cases like that, you should not be supplementing iron, because your body already has too much and it doesn't need anymore. The reason ferritin rises is to prevent the pathologic process from using the iron to its own benefit. Cancer grows dramatically faster in cases of higher bioavailability of iron. So what happens is, if there is an iron overload, what will happen is that serum copper will be either high or normal, but ceruloplasmin will be low. So you will have a situation where your cells are overloaded with iron, and at the same time you have too much copper that's floating around in your blood, and the body treats that just as it would do with any other, as a toxicity danger, and then it accumulates that copper in your brain and in your liver to prevent other cells from being killed by it. And basically what happens is that you get a situation where your metabolism is not working properly because copper is not bioavailable, and because of the increased iron and the interaction it has with the polyunsaturated fats, you have a much higher chance of developing some kind of a chronic health condition. Basically, you really don't want to be in a situation where iron is high at the expense of copper. It's a fine balance, but if you have to be high on something, I would rather have it be copper, especially combined with high ceruloplasmin, because that's what allows your metabolism to work properly. High iron status doesn't get you anything good unless you are a 4-year-old child and basically you want to produce a lot of red blood cells and you want to grow. So iron is a factor of growth, while copper, properly utilized, is a factor of metabolism and differentiation.
Yeah, I just want to be totally clear here, because there's a group of people that think that high copper is responsible for all health problems. And they go off the work of Carl Pfeiffer, Anne Louise Gittleman, and a guy named Andy Cutler. And they have a huge protocol of taking like cysteine, molybdenum, and all these copper chelators. But you're talking about something different. You're talking about the metabolism and cytochrome C oxidase and the activity of that absorbing copper. And when the metabolism is slowed down, there's going to be anomalous behavior of these essential minerals and many vitamins. So I don't want to put words in your mouth. Is that accurate?
That's very accurate. Basically, what I'm saying is that without the proper tools for copper utilization, it can become a very toxic factor. But by the way, so can magnesium, which everybody tends to think of very favorably. However, without proper generation of ATP to which magnesium is bound, you can get a magnesium toxicity as well. You can actually die from magnesium overdose if you're not properly utilizing it. Most people, fortunately, because magnesium toxicity basically happens in stages, and the stage, fortunately, the first few stages are a violent diarrhea, right? So you basically end up excreting excreting it faster than it can actually kill you. But it is possible to actually die from intravenous magnesium. And it has happened in hospitals. It can stop your heart. It is a central nervous system depressant, and if it's not properly utilized, it can actually cause toxicity and kill you as well. So copper can be dangerous, but again, the proper utilization of copper. So can anything else. Calcium, I think, many people are saying, oh, calcium is so bad. Why does Ray recommend taking all this calcium? Well, without calcium, your metabolism cannot function. The proper functioning of the Krebs cycle requires calcium. However, if calcium is not properly disposed of, then of course you can get excitotoxicity and the cell can die. So it really comes down to thyroid hormone as this master regulator of the utilization of all of these substances that are in the environment in our food, that without it, anything can really become toxic.
We started with estrogen, and then we talked a little bit about prolactin, and then I want to talk about serotonin too, and the known fact that serotonin reuptake inhibitors, antidepressants, increase prolactin and can lead to osteoporosis. So can you talk about how these three things could be linked in an easy to understand manner, referring to estrogen, prolactin, and serotonin?
Sure. I mean, I think in some of the previous shows I called them they're part of the field of sickness, right? If you think of as fields as basically different signals that mediate and signal cells in the neighborhood whether things are going well or not going well. Serotonin, prolactin, estrogen, cortisol, adrenaline, growth hormone. Basically, all of these signals are part of the field of sickness, and they tend to go together. Now, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they do have some positive properties, but they're not due to serotonin. It was found as early as the 1980s that the primary mechanism of action of the famous drug Prozac is not serotonin. It is actually, it dramatically increases the synthesis of allopregnanolone in the brain, which is one of the most important neurosteroids. It's a metabolite of progesterone, which itself is a metabolite of pregnenolone. It's one of the most important neurosteroids for maintenance of proper mood. So that's really how Prozac works. But of course, the drug industry wouldn't just give you a drug that's good for you, give you something that has terrible side effects due to the high serotonin, so they can give you another drug to balance that. Anything that increases serotonin, of course, will increase estrogen. These two, I don't know of anything else that goes so well together. I mean, estrogen and serotonin are the primary mediators of fatigue under any kind of stress. So if you go running and you overexert yourselves, the two things that will rise are basically serotonin and estrogen, and then a little bit later, prolactin will rise due to the elevation of the free fatty acids and growth hormone as well. However, so these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors increase the availability of serotonin to the cells, and as such, the serotonin stimulates the pituitary to release the growth hormone and basically to stimulate the adrenals to produce estrogen, and this also stimulates the enzyme aromatase in every tissue, so you'll start synthesizing estrogen in virtually every cell. The problem with these drugs, aside from their serotonicity and the fact that they increase prolactin, just like I said, they also increase estrogen. And recently there has been a black box warning, I think, on the drug Lexapro. I'm surprised it's only Lexapro, because all of the SSRIs tend to have a very similar mechanism of action. But Lexapro has recently acquired a black box warning of dramatically increasing the risk of breast cancer. And if estrogen is one of the major causative factors of breast cancer, even according to mainstream medicine, that immediately tells you, what these SSRI drugs are doing systemically. Now, this is a drug that's supposed to work primarily in the brain, right? The pharma industry loves isolated action, basically something that works on only one receptor and it does only one thing, and when it's done, it's gone and there's no side effect. It doesn't work like that. There's a long-term communication between cells across the entire body. So if you have something that's detrimental, well, the pharma industry calls it really good, in other words, increasing serotonin in your brain, this is going to have dramatic effects, given that the brain is the master regulator of the cellular activity everywhere in the body. So if you give the brain a poison like serotonin, of course, every other organ will suffer as a consequence. And because of the connection between serotonin and estrogen, women taking these SSRI drugs have been found to have, specifically Lexapro. I mean, I'll see if this happens for the other drugs as well. But so far, it's only Lexapro. Women have a much higher chance of developing the so-called triple negative breast cancer, which is considered the worst one you can get because it's considered resistant to hormonal therapy. In other words, it's considered estrogen independent. Nothing really can be further from the truth. This triple negativity, the only thing it means is that it's the most abnormal kind of tissue, which you can see during biopsy. And by the way, the use of SSRI drugs also increases the risk of breast cancer in men. And that's something that probably most people are not aware of, but men can also get breast cancer. And in men, it tends to be dramatically more lethal than in women. And taking an SSRI drug has already been proven to be associated with increased risk of breast cancer in men as well.
And anybody interested for the 2015 view of estrogen or serotonin rather, should check out Is Serotonin an Upper or Downer by Andrews P.W. Yeah, I think you posted about that paper too, right? It could have been written by Ray Pete as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. And as a result of that, I think of that study, a few more came out. I think in the latest conference of the American Psychological Association, APA. By the way, I work only a few blocks from their headquarters. There was a big conference over the summer in which there was a big ruckus that this paper caused, and some people actually resigned from the board of directors because they were so opposed to the idea that serotonin, which has been promoted as the feel-good hormone, as the happiness hormone in the brain for over 4, I think even 5 decades, and so many people's careers are based on that presumption, that now that this truth that's basically diametrically opposite to what has been proposed for the last 50 years, when this truth is starting to come out, it's causing basically people to resign. Probably because a lot of them are on the board of directors of pharma companies. They have conflict of interest, and the fact that this truth is coming out means doesn't bode well for their future careers, and maybe even their criminal status. We'll see what happens, but APA was not a happy place over in July.
I'm fairly certain Brad and Jeremy of On the Back of a Tiger actually interviewed him, so we'll see how that went. I want to talk about 2 more things. I want to talk about parathyroid hormone, and I also want to talk about the tetracyclines and gut bacteria influencing the production of serotonin. So do you want to talk about parathyroid hormone, and then we can traverse into gut bacteria?
Sure. In the last, I would say, 10 years or so, there have been a dramatic increase in the so-called secondary hyperparathyroidism, right? So the primary hyperparathyroidism is caused usually by a benign tumor in the parathyroid gland. This causes the dramatic increase in the production of parathyroid hormone, which is characterized by, of course, immediate bone resorption, increase in prolactin, breaking bones prematurely, dramatic slowdown of metabolism as well, because parathyroid hormone is known to do that, immediate insulin resistance, and eventually the development of diabetes in people who, even according to mainstream medicine, are not genetically susceptible. So parathyroid hormone is not something that you want to have elevated. Animals that have had their parathyroid gland removed are resistant to the induction of diabetes by virtually any chemical known to cause it in an animal model. Secondary hyperparathyroidism can be caused by a number of things. Again, it's characterized by increased levels of parathyroid hormone in the blood, but the most common one is actually dietary calcium deficiency. In the absence of sufficient calcium in the bloodstream, parathyroid hormone will increase, and it will do 2 things. The first one is it will increase bone resorption, so you'll basically provide calcium from the bone because calcium is so vital for the cellular metabolism. The second thing it will do is it will increase the conversion. It will signal the kidneys to increase the conversion of the vitamin D3, cholecalciferol, into the so-called active vitamin D, which is calcitriol. And calcitriol increases the absorption of calcium from the intestine. Unfortunately, calcitriol also dramatically increases the calcification of soft tissue. So basically, parathyroid hormone, which in some countries, by the way, is approved drug for osteoporosis, is known to, at best, not improve bone health, and at worst, give you insulin resistance, diabetes, and calcification, especially of the arteries. So parathyroid hormone can accelerate the development of cardiovascular disease, a process which usually takes 20 to 30 years. It can basically shrink it down to as quickly as 2 or 3. If you purposefully restrict calcium from your diet, you will paradoxically, for people that don't understand the process, you will get thinner bones and also soft tissue calcification under the influence of parathyroid hormone. And some of the things that lower parathyroid hormone, if it's secondary, if it's primary, and you have a tumor, obviously that's a different situation. But secondary one of the easiest things you can do is increase dietary calcium and potentially supplement some vitamin D. Both of these lower parathyroid hormone. Niacinamide lowers parathyroid hormone. The antihistamine drug used for excess stomach acidity, famotidine, the H2 antagonist, in other words, the first generation anti-acid drugs also lower parathyroid hormone. Aspirin lowers parathyroid hormone. There's a lot of things you can do that are simple, cheap, and available over the counter to basically save yourself the trouble of soft tissue calcification. It's really not a pleasant thing. And if it has already occurred, one of the safest and most effective things you can do is basically take a higher dose vitamin K, especially the MK-4 version, menatetrinone, which has been shown to reverse soft tissue calcification caused by warfarin.
It seems like every 6 months there's an article about how milk does not protect your bones. And absent from all these kinds of articles are words like parathyroid hormone or prolactin or estrogen. They seem to be completely out of context and kind of scare or fear mongering rather. And it just doesn't seem, I don't know if these articles are just for clicks or what, but a lot of people forward them to me and they don't change my mind on anything because they're not really actually talking about any of the science behind bone health.
Well, I think if you remind them of this, you could give them the analogy of copper and iron and how basically in the absence of proper metabolism, anything can be dangerous. I think even Ray somebody asked him that same question, said, how can you recommend people take between 2 and 3 grams of calcium per day, given that calcium is so, excitotoxic, it has been implicated in prostate cancer, it can calcify soft tissues. And basically Ray said the same thing, in a state of hypothyroidism, anything is dangerous, even looking at the sun. So the whole idea of basically, but of course, just like, just because something can be dangerous, it doesn't necessarily mean you immediately have to restrict it. You have to look at the context of why is it dangerous and what other roles calcium plays inside the body. Again, in a state of functional calcium deficiency, metabolism will not work well, and you will continue to lose bone mass, and not only you'll lose that bone mass, but whatever you don't piss out in your urine, and it will immediately go and calcify your kidneys, your heart, and the vessels around them. So you'll get soft tissue calcification, kidney disease, heart disease, stroke, anything that comes with soft tissue calcification. And one of the reasons why these most epidemiological studies, so far I'm not aware of any double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled study that looked at one group had calcium from supplements or milk or something and followed them over a few years. The few that have been done, I think, are always epidemiological studies, so they've only looked at correlation. But if you only take calcium without looking at the bigger picture, in other words, how is your thyroid function? Is your vitamin D3 and vitamin K status sufficient? Is your vitamin E and A status sufficient? In other words, are you also intaking sufficient quantities of magnesium? There are many things that play a role here, and just blaming milk because it's high in calcium is I think is at best misguided. It's just one of these things that somebody found a connection between fire and fireman. So what this means is that whenever there's a fire, we should prevent these guys going there because they're always associated with fire. I tend to view with really high suspicion any kind of epidemiological study that is not also backed up or preceded or followed by some kind of a randomized placebo-controlled study, even if it's in animals. Usually they're not. If you see an article in the press that blames like meat or calcium, it's usually very narrow-sighted and it doesn't take enough factors into account to really give you a good idea of what you should or you shouldn't eat.
Do you want to talk about your research on the tetracyclines and how they protect against developing osteoporosis and in some cases even reverse it?
Vitamin K, especially the menatetrinone, the MK4, is actually a pharmacological, it's a pharma-approved drug in Japan, Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, and South Korea for the treatment, not just prevention, for the treatment of even advanced osteoporosis. And the dosage is between 15 to 45 milligrams per day. Basically, vitamin K has a big role in the synthesis and the activity of the osteocalcin protein. But the reason I said it's a naphthoquinone, I wanted to bring this up, is because other quinones that are very similar to it in structure, such as the tetracycline antibiotics and also the lapachones from palo d'arco tree and emodin, all of these quinones have also been found to be very beneficial for bone problems. So the tetracycline antibiotics, I think it's a great misfortune, and it's very sad that the general public only thinks of them as antibiotics. I think it would be much more helpful if people thought of them as quinones, as electron withdrawing substances that stimulate metabolism. And I think that should immediately, and the parallel in the structure to vitamin K, which is a known bone protector and a reversing agent of soft tissue calcification, should give some idea of the parallels between them. And by the way, that they have already been tested in human trials, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials where lower doses of the tetracycline antibiotics, I think the last one I saw was 20 milligrams of doxycycline twice a day, or 50 milligrams of tetracycline once a day. So total dose of between 40 and 50 milligrams per day, which officially is considered too low to have an antibiotic activity, reversed osteoporosis in women. And these women were in their late 60s at a time where basically the process of osteoporosis is considered pretty much irreversible. Quinones, which happen to also stimulate metabolism and are similar in structure to vitamin K, a very, very potent anabolic effect on bone health and metabolism.
So Ray closes his article with, a person could easily perceive changes in appetite, quality of sleep, changes in skin, hair, and mood, etc. But blood tests could be used to confirm that the right choices were being made. Tests for vitamin D, parathyroid hormone, free fatty acids, and carbon dioxide or bicarbonate, as well as the hormones, can be helpful if a person isn't sure whether diet, sunlight exposure, and thyroid supplementation is adequate. So do you have any tests that you think would be good for somebody either that had this issue or was thinking that might be in their future? For instance, baldness is related to reduce bone mineral density. What do you think about somebody kind of striving to go the extra mile and figure out how to solve this problem?
I think some of the blood tests can be very useful. I mean, we already touched upon some of them. I think a blood test for prolactin can be very useful. A blood test for parathyroid hormone can be very useful, but they should always be done together, because when you go to the doctor, first of all, the doctor will probably fight you and refuse to put in some of these tests in if he or she thinks that the insurance will not cover them. And then if they do, they'll basically they'll do a partial picture. For example, many doctors will just do a test for vitamin D3, which it can show deficiency, but it doesn't tell you the whole picture. So the things that need to be done together, in my opinion, are as I mentioned, prolactin, parathyroid hormone, vitamin D3, the activated vitamin D called calcitriol, carbon dioxide, vitamin K is very important. And in order to get prolactin is a great assessor also of serotonin and estrogen function, but you can also add a test for the hormone called estrone, and especially estrone sulfate. It's also known as E1S. The estrone is known as estrogen 1. The levels of estrogen, of estrone, especially estrone sulfate, are a very good indicator of global estrogenic activity. I think the basic metabolic panel, which shows what the blood levels of calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium are, can also give you some idea. In other words, you don't want your serum calcium to be too low or too high. If it's too low, there may be a couple of things. Either you're overdosing on calcium, and basically what's happening is the parathyroid hormone is saying, don't produce more calcitriol, we don't need any more calcium. So basically, even though you're eating a lot of calcium, you've absorbed all that you need, and now the body is basically excreting most of it because it's not absorbing it. And also, you don't want the serum calcium to be too high, because that's not a good situation either. In the best case, actually, it's caused by a dietary calcium deficiency. So, the high parathyroid hormone will increase calcitriol, will increase absorption of calcium, and basically, if calcium is not used properly due to lack of CO2 or vitamin K, you'll float around and it will give you so-called secondary hypercalcemia. Hypercalcemia is also a very well known symptom of cancer. So you don't want your serum calcium to be too high. So I think that is a test that can be used always in combination with the others to give you some idea of where you stand. Again, if you're eating proper diet and avoiding stress and avoiding some of the foods that are known to be the primary mediators of inflammation, I think these tests become less important. But given the fact that we live in a society and an era where the food supply is so compromised, we're under a lot of stress, we're eating poison every day, we're given drugs that are toxic, that are known to be toxic to virtually every tissue, but especially the bone. We're living in an authoritarian environment where people are being told what to do versus, trying to figure it out for themselves and find what works for them. In a situation like that, you may need to do these blood tests every once in a while just to know where you stand. In other words, how much damage is being done to you by the environment. And forget about genes. So far, genes have not been able to explain anything other than a very, very small number, maybe that can be counted, on the fingers of both hands, of truly hereditary diseases. Because if genes were that important, trust me, pharma companies have been working on drugs that activate or suppress certain genes for the last 30 years. And drugs that are based on gene therapy, in other words, of silencing or activating genes, are extremely good for pharma because they're highly patentable, they can be approved for secondary conditions or off-label. In other words, the pharma, if a drug truly worked, it would have been a blockbuster, and pharma would have loved it. So they're putting an exorbitant amount of resources in actually trying to come up with such a drug, and they've tried for the last 30 years, and they've failed miserably to the point where I think we talked about it in one of the previous shows. The Human Genome Project is right now considered another an abysmal failure, and it's basically stationed for defunding, I think, over the next 2 years.
I totally agree. And just to piggyback on that, I've seen low prolactins, high parathyroid hormones, low vitamin Ds, and every combination in between. So I really think you're right. I think you have to get all of those tests together, and I wouldn't rely too heavily on any one test because it's just incredibly misleading, I think, a lot of the times. So I think it's super important. These tests aren't that expensive generally, so if you can get them all together, it's way better than getting either one alone, I think.
And I think even if you can get them, in other words, even if you do get them all together, don't forget that this is just a point in time. And the body, nothing in the universe is a point in time. It is a continuous flow of energy, which builds structure, which then supports more energy, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're going to be doing these tests, you probably need to do them, I don't know, maybe at least once a week, but that has its other side effects. It can actually increase artificially the levels of the enzyme lactate dehydrogenase, which will freak your doctor out if he or she finds out that this is high, for obvious reasons. We talked about its role in cancer and stuff like that. So anytime you get a venipuncture, LDH will rise. And if you do it consistently, it will rise to the point where it may be interpreted as you having meningitis, heart attack, or cancer. So it's kind of like a catch-22. In order for these tests to be useful, they need to be done all together and on a regular basis in order to give you a decent picture. However, they're also damaging. So I would actually try to focus on the environment in your diet first, and then resort to these tests only if you really feel like you're not making any progress, and your doctor agrees, and basically something needs to be done to give you an idea of where you stand. But yeah, basically I would not over rely on tests, even in combination, that are done like once a year as part of your annual medical exam. They can freak you out, and every time you stress, prolactin will jump. Every time you're stressed, cortisol will jump. Every time you're stressed, TSH will jump. Every time you're stressed, estrogen will jump. Every time you're stressed, serotonin will jump. So you can go and get a very, very misrepresentative picture of what your health looks like just because you're afraid of the doctor, or your doctor is an authoritarian type that tells you what to do versus listening to what you think is wrong with you. So basically, if you do these tests, I'll try to do them in when you're very calm and you think that everything is right. And ironically, due to the placebo effect, I don't believe there is such a thing. The brain is a powerful manifester of reality by creating a model. Basically, due to the so-called placebo effect, if you're feeling fine, your test will probably be normal, even if you had something going on, something bad going on. So I would not over rely on these medical tests.
Well said. Georgi, where can we find more of your work on the internet this week?
I post a lot of studies and discussions on the so-called Repeat Forum. It's www.repeatforum.com, one word. You can contact me there. My username is Haidut, Haid as in dog, U T as in Tom. My email is very simple. It's again haidut@gmail.com. And I also have a company for supplements in case people are interested. The website is www.idealabsdc.com. Idealabsdc is one word. I prefer that people contact me through the forum. Many more people will benefit from our discussion, and also for legal reasons, it's better if we take this to the public forum versus this being one-on-one. FDA doesn't like me playing doctor, even though I don't do that. But they can interpret it that way.
Georgi, thank you so much, man.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
That's going to conclude this week's episode. I'd like to thank Georgi again for talking with me today, along with my patrons from their support and making this and all the content I produce possible. Thank you so much. I sincerely appreciate it. And you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/DanaRoddy and donating 25 cents, 50 cents, $1 every month. And that really helps with all the content I produce and helps me eat and pay rent, and I really appreciate it. We're still working out exactly what the next week's show is going to be, so stay tuned for that. And you can find all the content I produce on Facebook as well as Twitter, or if you go to my website, DannyRoddy.com. And I usually post new content on Facebook Monday through Friday, as well as Patreon. So check those out. There's tons of material, and always please use the resources that Ray Pete has set up, which are just immense. And so the show basically doesn't end at this audio. There's so many resources out there that you can take advantage of and learn more about the so-called bioenergetic view of what we're talking about here. So look into that. Thanks for listening. We have an awesome listenership. The comments, emails, and everything are so amazing, so I appreciate it. And please hit that like button if you're on YouTube, and that really helps the show out too if you enjoyed it. So talk to you guys soon. Take care.